We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Republicans faced a hugely disappointing midterms as Democrats breathed relief as the anticipated red wave crashed before reaching the shores. What went wrong for the GOP? What went right for Democrats? And just what does the average American think of it all? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we have our dedicated Liberty Nation panel to help dissect the fun and the follies of the 2022 elections. All the facts, all the frenzy. I want to take a moment to thank our listeners out in Cadillac, Missouri on WATT 1240 AM and 106.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Reports suggested a veritable crimson tsunami, but what remained when the dust settled was, in most areas, little more than a trickle of your favorite red wine. Now, what went wrong for the GOP, or perhaps more importantly, what went right for Team Biden? We're fortunate to have on our LN panel with us today a longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, Mr. Graham J. Noble, Jeff Charles, and Scott D. Cosenza. Now, gents, first things first, what happened on the election, Tim?
Well, I think that it's interesting that there's been so much talk about how wrong the polls have been in recent years. This time the polls were essentially right in most of these close races. But in the past, the polls have been good at determining the key issues. And this time they were wrong about that. So it's like a reversal, because we had been assured that abortion had been subsumed by the economy and inflation and crime and the border, and that it was no longer a key issue. Then we come to find out that 27% of voters said that was the most important issue they voted on. It also, they were telling us that groups that were interviewed before the election, groups of voters were saying democracy is threatened. That's not what I'm going to vote on. Well, I think in a lot of the races where Trump-backed controversial candidates were, that became an issue as well. And I think it was underrated by the polls in advance. Look, both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, both believed there was going to be a red wave, that it would just be a matter of how much. And the fact that there isn't is going to be a cause for a lot of soul searching among Republicans who failed to really take solid control of the House, although they will get all the committee assignments and committee heads, and there's a lot of advantages to even having a one-vote majority. But there's going to be a lot of soul searching and a lot of questioning in the GOP.
Tim, you mentioned the polling that was done for the groups. I guess those are the exit polls where people talked about what impacted them. Now, Scott, do people in blue states just happen to like soaring inflation and rampant crime, in your opinion? Did they develop some kind of Stockholm syndrome during the coronavirus pandemic, do you think?
I'm going to be like a great politician, Mark, and answer a different question than the one that you asked me, which I'm going to comment on. You said to Tim, what went wrong for Republicans in the election? And Tim responded, and he used the word election. And there was no plural in either of your statements. And I just think that while there can be some information drawn by, the general trends of things, these were hundreds and over 1,000 elections that took place in America. And I just don't think it's best to kind of think of them as a group rather than individual contests, That I think is really the answer is they have to be picked apart individually, which of course we're not going to go through 1,000 elections. So I understand it's important to talk about the trends, but I just wanted to get that out that I do think that's sort of a critical factor as we go forward. But I just think if we're thinking about why did Stacey Abrams lose and John Fetterman win? He is, the worst possible candidate that you can think of, except for somebody who's assaulting children or somebody like that, and meanwhile, she, for a Georgia audience, is she really that, worse than Fetterman? I would have bet a lot of my net worth that those two would have flipped, right? That Fetterman would have lost and she had all that celebrity support.
Yeah.
I mean,
I can tell you what the difference was. The difference was the gubernatorial candidate on the ballot in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano, was a disaster as a gubernatorial candidate, and that brought Dr. Mehmet Oz down with him. In Georgia, you had Brian Kemp, very popular governor, and he carried Herschel Walker to at least the point of a runoff in Georgia. So, there's drag on a ticket in a midterm. If you have, in Ohio, for example, Mike DeWine won a 25-point victory for re-election as governor, and that dragged J.D. Vance across the finish line with a solid 7-point victory. That was the opposite of Pennsylvania. So one candidate on the ballot in a particular state can really have an effect down ballot or cross ballot on the other ones running for office.
Well, what do you think, Graham? Is it all coattails?
I certainly agree with Scott's analysis there that these are different races. You can't lump them all in together. But at the same time, I think a lot of this has to do with Democrat voters. I believe a lot of them in the end bought the narrative coming out of their party that these issues that Republicans are banging on about, which is crime and inflation, are not really things that we can blame Congress or the Biden administration for. Inflation's a global problem right now, so is it really anyone's fault over here? Crime, is there really, apart from some parts of the country, is crime really on the rise, or is it like as New York Governor Kathy Hochul said, it's really just a myth. It's a conspiracy theory on the part of the GOP. And I think Democrat voters, a lot of them thought to themselves, are we willing to relinquish control of the Senate to the Republicans based on these problems, which are larger problems and beyond our ability to control? As a result of Democrat voters not voting on the economy or crime or the border, they instead voted on more emotive issues such as abortion and the threat to democracy.
That's a good take on it. Jeff, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what happened. But like I've been saying, I think a part of the problem is that Republicans didn't really put forth a good alternative in a lot of these races. Doug Mastriano was not a good candidate. Bolduc in New Hampshire was not a good candidate. In some ways, the Democratic strategy of funding these people that are viewed as ultra right wing or MAGA or whatever you want to call them, it did have a level of success. But then you have a guy like Brian Kemp, who was not very in line with Trump at all, really, who even clashed with him, but still maintained enough popularity to defeat his opponent. Same thing with Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. He won his election handily, 60% of the vote. And while he has affiliated with Trump, he hasn't made his entire brand about Trump. So I think that what's happening is that when Republicans put forth a candidate that has a lot of the important issues in common with the America First crowd, without a lot of the other noise, they do better. Even in Georgia, that's going to go to a runoff between Warnock and Herschel Walker. Yes. And I'm not very confident that Walker is going to win in a runoff election. So on the right, you do have a problem with candidates, and I think that there may have been a missed opportunity for Republicans, but I don't think that Democrats are out of the woods yet either. I think the next couple of years are going to be very hard on them politically.
So not one overall thing, but 1,000 leaves of grass. Right, yeah. Gentlemen, we're with the LN panel talking about what happened during the midterm breakdown for Republicans and for Democrats. And we'll be right back after this short break talking the biggest shocks of the night. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five, produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.